Good morning from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining the global launch of Freedom House's flagship report, Freedom in the World. My name is Jamie Fly, and I serve as the new CEO of Freedom House. For those who are not familiar with our work, Freedom House is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing and defending freedom around the world. This year, we are celebrating our 85th anniversary, and since our founding in 1941, Freedom House has worked to support those on the front lines of the struggle for freedom. And we've also, for decades, advocated for American leadership in support of freedom. We inform the world about the threats to freedom. We mobilize support from leaders to counter those threats. And we provide direct assistance to activists and organizations who are fighting for democracy and human rights. Freedom of the World is our flagship annual report, and for 53 years, it has provided a comprehensive assessment of political rights and civil liberties around the globe. Freedom in the World is the oldest and most trusted report of its kind. Like our organization, Freedom House, this report is nonpartisan and independent. Freedom in the World is not funded by donations from any government. It is made possible by private donors who have no role in the editorial content of the report. This year's report is titled The Growing Shadow of Autocracy. It reflects Freedom House's rigorous, clear-eyed, and nonpartisan analysis. And in a moment, I'm going to pass over to the report co-authors, Dr. Yana Gorohovskaya, Catherine Grothe, and Amy Slipowitz, who are going to share the key findings. And then we're going to have a moderated conversation led by Matt Kaminsky. You can submit any questions that you have using the Q&A function in Zoom, and then Matt will get access to those questions and will do his best to incorporate those into the conversation he's moderating. With that, I'm pleased to hand it over to Yana to get us started. Yana?
Thanks for that, Jamie, and welcome to everyone joining us today. My name is Yana Gorohovskaya, and I'm really pleased to be here alongside my co-authors, Catherine Grothe and Amy Slipowitz, to talk about the findings of this year's Freedom in the World report. Before we dive into those, I want to extend our gratitude to the other people who worked on this report. Grant Baker, Grady Vaughn, Tyler Roylance, Shannon O'Toole, Katie LaRoque, and Adrian Shabazz, alongside many, many other people at Freedom House who provided their valuable input. This report is the culmination of over 10 months of work and hundreds of hours, and so I want to tell you a little bit about how it is that we do this research. First, Freedom in the World methodology covers 25 indicators, and it's derived from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We use that methodology to assess political rights and civil liberties as experienced by people living in a given place, whether those rights and liberties are impacted by their governments, a foreign government, or even non-state actors. Each of the 208 countries and territories that we assess receives a score on a 100-point scale, with 100 being the highest. And that score also translates into a status. And that's what you see here on our famous map. So green is for free, yellow is for partly free, and purple is for not free. Each year, we're fortunate to work with an extensive network of over 150 analysts and advisors. Many of them are based in the country or territory that they're assessing for us. Scores are only changed to reflect real-world events that have impacted rights, and only events that take place between January 1st and December 31st are included in each year's report. Now let's turn to the findings. Unfortunately, global freedom declined for the 20th consecutive year in 2025. Political rights and civil liberties worsened in 54 countries and improved in just 35. To put that in human terms, it means that about 40% of the world's population experienced some deterioration in rights, while only 7% saw some improvement. The two main factors that drove the most dramatic score changes last year were military coups d'etats and efforts by incumbent leaders to hold on to power through violence and manipulation. At 8 points lost, Guinea-Bissau had the year's biggest score change, and that was due to a coup which disrupted November's general election and eventually ousted the civilian government. Alongside Madagascar, this brought the total number of countries in Africa to have experienced successful coups since 2019 to 9, and many of those countries have experienced more than one coup during that time. The other big theme in 2025 was the liberal leaders cracking down on political opponents and sweeping away constitutional restraints on their power. This was the case in Tanzania, where incumbent President Samia Suluhu Hassan was declared the winner of a deeply flawed contest and then responded to widespread protests with unrestrained violence. The country declined as a result by 7 points. In El Salvador, which lost 5 points, authorities prosecuted critics of the government, drove journalists into exile, and passed a constitutional reform that abolished presidential term limits. In Georgia and Serbia, which lost 4 and 3 points respectively, authorities used disproportionate force against anti-government protesters and threatened and retaliated against their critics. I know that many people tuning in today are wondering how the events of the past year have impacted freedom in the United States. The US was one of only 3 countries rated free to experience a decline, and the score declined by a total of 3 points due to both long-term patterns as well as new developments during President Donald Trump's first year in office. I'll explain each one of these declines in turn. First, a point was lost because of chronic partisan gridlock in Congress culminated in the longest government shutdown in US history. And this actually happened in parallel with the executive exercising unilateral power over responsibilities that are assigned to Congress by both the Constitution and statutory law. Second, personal expression was chilled by a multi-year rise in threats and reprisals for political expression, as well as the new administration's efforts to punish non-violent speech by non-citizens. Finally, ethical standards and anti-corruption safeguards were weakened as a result of the president's promotion of business ventures controlled by his family, the solicitation of large gifts and donations by corporations and foreign governments, and the removal of inspectors general and other staff at agencies tasked with anti-corruption enforcement. The US score now stands at 81 out of 100. The country still remains rated free, but as you can see on this graph, the most recent score decline has brought the total number of points lost over the last 20 years to 12. So by comparison, that is a bigger decline than what we've seen in Brazil or South Africa or the majority of the member states of the European Union, but it is a smaller decline than we've seen in Hungary or India, both countries that have dropped out of the free category during the last 2 decades. We're going to spend the rest of this presentation zooming out because 2025 was not just a single bad year for freedom, it marked the 20th consecutive year of decline. That means more countries have seen fundamental rights for their populations degrade than improve every single year since 2005. On this graph, you will see that the impact of those 2 decades of democratic backsliding has been uneven. While the portion of countries rated free has remained about the same, that's the top green part of this graph, weaker democracies, countries we rate as partly free, have slid into autocracy and conflict. And you see how the band of the yellow part of this graph gets narrower. This transformation has not only affected the political trajectory of individual countries, it has also reshaped the international order by swelling the number of global autocracies. I'm going to turn the presentation over now to Catherine Grothe, Senior Research Analyst and one of the co-authors, to explain the factors we identified as being mainly responsible for this historic change.
Thanks, Yana. So to understand what drove 2 decades of global deterioration in freedom, we identified and then coded events that produced the biggest score declines every year since 2005. It's important to note that these events do not explain every negative change in every country. Rather, they explain the largest sudden declines globally. And our analysis produced 4 categories summing up the biggest threats to freedom. These are coups d'etats, violence and armed conflict, intensifying authoritarian repression, and overreach by elected leaders. I'll now briefly address each one in turn. So first, we saw last year coups instantly destroy democratic institutions. But coups also pose a longer-term danger to fundamental rights as juntas increase repression over time to hold on to power. The most striking example is in Mali, whose score has dropped by 53 points since 2005, the most of any country in our index. Over the last 20 years, the country has experienced three coups, which shattered the political system and undermined many civil liberties. In 2025, the junta in Mali tightened its grip on power by dissolving all political parties and indefinitely expanding the president's term in office. So, after becoming less frequent in the 1980s and 90s, coups, coup attempts, and autogolpes are now on the rise and a serious threat to freedom across the world. Violence and armed conflict have also contributed to some of the biggest declines during the last 20 years, and this is in places like the Central African Republic, Ethiopia, Ukraine, and Yemen. Armed conflict jeopardizes physical safety, property rights, and freedom of movement. The impact of war is often disproportionately felt, as we've seen in places like Sudan, by already vulnerable groups like women and ethnic and religious minorities. Furthermore, few conflicts remain contained in a single country, and they often spill across borders and attract mercenaries and interventions by foreign powers. In the long run, armed conflict can hinder freedoms by forcing countries to undertake the difficult tasks of rebuilding democracy and state institutions simultaneously. The third factor driving much of the deterioration over the last 20 years is the escalation of authoritarian repression. All around the world, autocrats are weaponizing the state against their own citizens. They're using state companies to enrich themselves, deploying security services against peaceful protesters, and using the courts to jail their opponents. Russia, which scores 12 out of 100 on our index, has used all of these tactics and more. Recently, the Kremlin, which is still waging its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, escalated its propaganda by designating two independent media outlets as terrorist organizations for the first time. In Hong Kong, the Chinese Communist Party has increasingly undermined fundamental freedoms, including freedom of the media, as exemplified by the recent conviction of pro-democracy activist and former media owner Jimmy Lai. As a result of Beijing's growing control over Hong Kong, the territory has experienced one of the largest declines globally over the last 2 decades. So, understandably, coups, wars, and authoritarian crackdowns raise alarms by capturing international headlines. But the last 20 years have produced another serious threat to freedom. Leaders who first gain office through relatively competitive elections and go on to undermine checks to their own power. This is the story of El Salvador, Hungary, Nicaragua, Turkey, Venezuela, and many other countries. Democratic institutions are important because they offer counterweights to executive power and limit what presidents and prime ministers can do unilaterally. They also expose their decisions to independent scrutiny. And for these reasons, leaders have sought to undermine and subjugate these institutions. Notably, these attacks don't all come at once. They're gradual, but the impact is clear. Let's take Hungary, for example, which has experienced sustained democratic decline under Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party. Since coming to power, Fidesz has used gerrymandering, among other tactics, to achieve and maintain a supermajority in parliament, as well as constitutional reforms to consolidate control over the country's independent institutions. Hungary was rated free in 2005 with a score of 93 out of 100. It was downgraded to partly free in 2018, and it now only scores 62 out of 100. So now let me turn the presentation over to Amy Slipowitz, research manager and our co-author.
Thank you, Catherine. The global decline in freedom has not only unevenly impacted countries, but it has also weakened some fundamental rights more than others. Our data show that freedom of the media, freedom of personal expression, and access to due process have seen the most deterioration since 2005. In terms of the media, dramatic attacks such as assassination or long-term imprisonments of journalists are relatively rare. However, economic pressure, regulatory influence, and legal harassment are pervasive and very damaging. Proliferating use of spyware, monitoring of social media, and offline informant networks are some of the ways that governments are chilling speech and inhibiting free and open discussion, even in private settings around the world. Finally, increasing political control of courts and the police is undermining justice and allowing for the prosecution of critics and opponents of governments. Autocrats are not the only culprit. It's important to note that democratically elected leaders have also chipped away at these rights as they seek to insulate themselves from criticism and oversight. Before turning to our recommendations, I want to spend just a moment examining some of the positive news from last year and over the last 2 decades. 20 years of decline in global freedom is a daunting finding, but it is important to remember that during every one of those years, including last year, there were always places where rights and liberties improved. Bolivia, Fiji, and Malawi all improved from partly free to free in 2025. No countries moved in the opposite direction last year. These changes were driven by the peaceful transitions of power after competitive elections, as well as gradual improvements in judicial independence and social freedoms. Sri Lanka registered one of the largest improvements last year. The country's score increased by 5 points as the government worked to combat corruption and to promote religious tolerance. Syria, which was a bright spot in 2024, alongside Botswana and Guatemala, improved again in 2025 by 5 points. Though it remained not free, modest progress did continue in the rebuilding of political institutions and the loosening of restrictions on basic rights. Historically, too, our data show that consolidated democracies are very durable political systems. 76 countries of the 88 countries rated free today were free in 2005. And democracies can also be built from seemingly unlikely conditions. Bhutan, for example, has successfully transitioned from an absolute monarchy to an electoral democracy. And it is not alone. 52 countries have seen overall improvements in their political rights and civil liberties during the last 20 years. Unfortunately, the 20th year of decline in freedom did overlap with another significant development, and that was the turning away by democracies from their traditional role as supporters and defenders of freedom abroad. The American government, which was once the largest bilateral donor of aid in the world, completely upended its approach to assistance. Meanwhile, European leaders pulled back from spending on overseas development assistance. At the same time, autocrats have consolidated power at home while banding together abroad to reshape the international order in their own image. Democracies must act now to reverse both long-term deterioration in global freedom and recent declines. Our report features many detailed recommendations, which can be found on our website. For now, I'll highlight just a few of those. First, to take back global momentum, democracies need to engage in principled diplomacy, coalition building, and bloc voting at international institutions. Governments should loudly, consistently, and collectively condemn coups, rigged elections, violations of term limits, and human rights violations. We also need to cut the ties that bind us to autocrats by reducing their ability to use economic leverage to undermine democratic decision-making. Democracies should confront corruption and close financial pathways that sustain authoritarian rule through our own financial systems and institutions. Finally, in light of both events last year and longer-term trends, it is time to reimagine international democracy assistance and to put serious effort into bringing together the private sector, organized labor, and philanthropies to invest in norms that benefit us all, such as free expression and the rule of law. The path forward is not going to be an easy one, but we must begin walking it together if we hope that the next 20 years bring greater security, prosperity, and freedom. Thank you for your attention. We are very grateful for the support of our donors, and we encourage listeners today to visit our website to make a donation to help Freedom in the World continue research that now spans more than half a century. We'll now turn it over to Matthew Kaminsky, editorial chair at Middle East Broadcasting Networks and founding editor of Politico Europe, who will moderate our panel.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks to Yana and Catherine as well. So Yana is going to join would join us for the panel for the next hour or so, along with Tom Carothers, of a longtime scholar and expert on democracy from the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, as well as Maya Tudor, as a professor of politics and public policy at St. Hilda's College at the University of Oxford. And then please do put some questions in the Q&A chat. And what we'll do is have a conversation among ourselves for the next half hour or so, and then we'll turn to questions for the remainder of our time. Clearly, we're in a freedom recession for the last 20 years, and it's not getting any better. Maybe I can start with Tom, who's been tracking this for longer than 20 years. Anything here struck you as surprising or even hopeful?
Well, I turned to the report hoping maybe it was going to be a breath of fresh air, and that it was going to surprise me. And maybe I hadn't been following things as closely as I thought, and I'd see this. But, it's kind of like if you're a fan of a really losing sports team for a very long time, you begin to kind of get used to it. Did anything surprise me? No, but I think there are some things that are worth highlighting. I think we could go a step deeper on the causes. I think a couple of the causes that were mentioned are good, but I think we could go underneath the surface. For example, authoritarian repression. That's really more a description of the fact that freedom is shrinking in those countries. It doesn't explain why. Why is authoritarian repression increasing? There, I think it gets interesting because arguably, a number of autocrats like China and Russia are having trouble meeting the governance demands of their people because they're not, in some ways, Russia's doing a quite poor job on governance. China has fairly high expectations and have trouble maintaining growth. And as a result, a little bit of freedom that they've been allowing, they have to squelch it. They have to tighten the screws, as Putin has been doing in Russia, because they just feel they can't afford it. And similar in Iran. Iran has gotten much more repressive over the last 20 years because the people keep pushing it against it. And so what really seems to be going on, why is authoritarian repression increasing? Because authoritarians are under pressure from their citizens, which you could take as good news even in the midst of bad news. Of course, it's terrible news for Chinese and Russian and Iranians and others in these countries where the screws are being tightened. But it shows it's not static. So I think if we look at the next level of causes, it's not necessarily surprising, but it puts things in a slightly different light. Some other thoughts, but I don't want to go on too long at first here.
Yeah, I think we can definitely dwell on what's happening within repressive countries, but my mind turns to what is the dynamics within the free world, and there you're seeing declines. The most notable one in the U.S., but also in other countries that we have gotten used to thinking of as being free, such as India, obviously Hungary across the EU. And I wonder, maybe Maya, this is something that you can take up, is what's happening in the free world really? And are these causes kind of endemic to our societies, or is China and Russia sort of pushing and promoting an alternative view of running things that is seeping into our political cultures and institutions?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. Absolutely, the Russias and Chinas of the world have a playbook, and it involves discrediting democracy as a system of governance. And I think it's here, probably by the nature of the people who've come to listen to this, they understand this basic evidence base that democracies really do deliver. And I think that's just worth highlighting. I mean, I teach in a very, very global school, and I regularly have students who come to me and say, well, look, democracies in the West aren't working. They're gridlocked, they don't get things done, they don't deliver. And that is absolutely a perception that's out there. And it's worth, I think, just setting the record straight on that and on the dimensions of things like infant mortality, violence, years of schooling. But importantly, because everyone really cares about this, economic growth, democracies do better on average. So, what is going on? I think there is partly this is about external forces, but I think it's also about internal forces. I think some of the presentation already talked about this, but it's about a, leaders that are elected through entirely legitimate means, but they use a kind of populist rhetoric in which the elites are part of the problem. And then they come to power, and then they have a problem, which is they've just criticized the elites, but they've become part of them. So then they often go about dismantling the sort of horizontal constraints on executive power. And that's the pattern we're seeing, which is what you asked about, Matt, in the established democracies. It's really democratic erosion. So, right, democracy is not dying through tanks rolling on the street. It's sort of death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah, I mean, I think let's go to the U.S., which is going to get a lot of the attention in this report. And I guess Yana, I want to ask you it's a nonpartisan conversation in a nonpartisan setting, but this issue gets partisan very quickly. To what degree can you separate the signal and the noise about, the erosion of rule of law in this country, the idea of executive overreach, obviously official corruption? Where do you all see the Trump era? But this is going back 10 years, by the way, that the U.S. has been in decline, and that includes 4 years of the Biden administration as well. But to what degree is Trump taking actions that are actually taking apart the American system of democratic governance, or is it in fact more resilient than we realize? You saw the Supreme Court push back. The courts have been very effective in kind of checking what this administration is trying to do. I just wonder. I wouldn't want this to get lost in all the kind of noise around this town, this presidency that seems to accompany it.
Yeah, thanks for that, Matt. I mean, so our report actually goes back even further. The decline in the U.S. Is 20 years old. So that goes back to obviously Obama's administration, the first Trump administration, Biden administration. So what we've seen is that there's been a steady decline, both under Democratic and Republican administrations. But I also want to note that what makes our report unique is that we're measuring the ability of people to exercise their freedoms. We're not measuring government performance. Government performance is really important. The government has a lot of control over people's lives, how they can exercise freedoms, and certainly that's an aspect of it. But we're looking at the ability of people to exercise political rights and civil liberties. And that's impacted by lots of different factors. Some of them come from the government. Some of them can come from subnational actors, the courts, the states themselves in the US, obviously. And so looking back on these 20 years, the declines have come from growing influence of money in politics, which has reshaped sort of the political system. It's reshaped how campaigns take place, who is involved in them, the positions that candidates take. We've seen discrimination in the criminal justice system, which is a long-term problem in the United States. That really affects the rule of law. I think people, certain events catch headlines, but the reality is that, the incarcerated population in the US is really high. The justice system, moves slowly. There are lots of problems. These are long-standing issues. There are also issues with media freedom in the US that predate what's been happening in the last year and have to do with media deserts and the lack of sort of independent, accessible media for people. So there are many problems. I don't think we should shy away from naming the problems that emerged last year. I think corruption is sort of top of mind. And that I think goes back to what Maya was saying. The sort of attacks on institutions, some of them are attacks on norms, and some of them are sort of manipulations of existing rules. And that's kind of, I think, what we saw with the United States in terms of undermining anti-corruption norms last year.
I'm going to be revealing my own biases here, but it's you sort of mentioned media and then the decline in trust in media, the sort of simultaneous collapse of local media because the business models have been eviscerated. And it seems like a 20-year period also coincides with the technological revolution, the previous one. Now we're going into the AI one, which is the next one. And so I wonder, maybe Tom, kind of pushing this to you, is the U.S. in a kind of democratic, I wouldn't call it a death spiral, but certainly a downward spiral, and is this something that can be reversed, or are these kind of secular trends around technology, around media, around the behavior of sort of the changed behavior of sort of citizens that are going to be very difficult to address, and actually you will see play out in other countries, including in the EU, which is kind of the teacher's pet here and in your index, but they are bound to experience the same things.
I would step back on the U.S. And look at it slightly different than how you framed it, Matthew. You said, well, at various places in the free world, in the countries that are free, there's trouble. You mentioned Hungary, India, the U.S., but actually turn that around and look at it differently. Make the following statement and think about it. The United States is the only wealthy industrial democracy that has experienced serious slippage in the last 20 years. That's different. Actually, the story is democratic resilience among the wealthy established democracies. And the US is a strange outlier. And so the real question is, why is the United States such an outlier? Why is it with India or other countries in the global south? Why is it the only country out of this circle of wealthy established democracies that's gone so far backward? So I don't think we should put it in terms of the free world is showing lots of trouble. The free world is showing a lot of resilience, but why not the United States? Now that gets into some very hard questions. There's a whole series of factors. Jana mentioned political money, for example, which is quite different in the United States than most wealthy established democracies. Our various features of our political system are quite different. And one could go down the road. Our Conservative Party has evolved differently. VDAM has done this interesting study showing that the Republican Party is now something of an outlier among conservative parties and wealthy industrial democracies, and so forth. So that really gets to the more interesting question of what's distinctive about the United States. So if you take a structural factor to tie into your question, Matthew, like, okay, the media landscape has changed dramatically over the last 20 years, that must be it. Well, wait a minute. Norway has experienced the same shift in its media landscape. It's a very technologically savvy country and people are really online and so forth. No democratic slippage. On down through the line of lots of countries that have experienced many of the same shifts in the media structure, but not experienced democratic decline. So if we focus only on the US and see different potential causes without looking at it comparatively, I think we tend to overdetermine the question in certain ways, think it must be this, it must be that. But then why haven't others?
Maya, what do you think? But I do wonder, I'll push my theory back on again, pecking as you, Tom, that in Europe you have, let's talk about personalities. You have a potential Nigel Farage prime ministership in the UK. You have a potential AfD-led government in Germany. You have a potential Le Pen-led government in France. And the US is the oldest democracy. Why would these countries that are actually much younger in terms of their democratic sort of story, except for the UK, prove resilient? Is there something that is keeping Europe kind of resilient that is not seen in the US? And let's take that money as one of the factors, but some of the others do not apply.
But it's not just Europe. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. There's a lot of democratic resilience out there. Let's not just pick on Europe. Yeah, Europe has some. Clearly, it's being shaken by new political forces and so forth, as are some of the countries that I mentioned. But still, I think we, instead of saying the United States is the harbinger of what the world is about to be, I think that's a bit of American narcissism. I think most Europeans look at what's been happening in the United States and say, wow, Donald Trump would be very unlikely to get elected in our country. Yes, the people that you mentioned have some similarities, but they also have some significant differences. I think there are many French people who feel that if the National Front in its current form comes to power, it will not be the same kind of disruption that the United States has seen in the last year or the last 10 years, for that matter.
Maya, what do you how do we then reverse it? And that's maybe a question to all three of you. And we can talk about how we can promote democracy in the less free parts of the world. But let's stay with the industrialized West or the free world, and maybe let's also stay narcissistic for a few more minutes, since I know that 3 out of 4 of us are in Washington. About what would sort of how would you go about trying to fix this in the U.S.?
Well, so one of the things has already been pointed to in the policy recommendations part of the Freedom House report, which is to channel the energy of youth who have been in many parts of the free world actually increasingly disenchanted with democracy. And there is a real desire to I think, get involved with politics if it can be a politics that addresses the issues that they face, whether that's, the lack of access to housing or the AI disruption. And, there is excellent work, Sue Stokes's work, The Backsliders, which talks about the economic foundations to backsliding, which runs through youth apathy vis-a-vis democracy. But a really noticeable thing is that where democracy has been taken away, there's a lot of desire to resuscitate it. And I know you asked us to focus on the free world, but in South Asia, there have been a number of movements led by youth that have really revolutionized politics. Just a couple of weeks ago, a Nepali rapper, former mayor of Kathmandu, won the election. And so it's not just the reversal of this trend, to answer your question, has to come, I think, through reaching groups that I think have been marginalized and feel dissatisfied with the current state of affairs and channeling that into real organization, right? So I think that's one of the important ways forward. And it's been done. The other thing I'd say is that, at moments of elections, which are the real moments where some of this can be reversed, people need to turn out at the ballot box in large numbers, and of us here needs to own that decision at that moment.
But isn't it, I mean, where have we seen recently in the last 10, 20 years a successful democratic uprising? And aren't there limitations to what civic society can accomplish? We're thinking about the color revolutions in the former Soviet Union. 2 out of 3 of them in Kyrgyzstan and Georgia didn't turn out that well at all.
Yeah.
The Morocco one's very interesting. The Nepal still at TBD on how that really
Right.
goes, right? So, what are the limitations to people coming out on the streets and saying we want freedom? Or how can you better
Well,
handle it? Yeah.
yeah. So I think I want to draw a distinction here between just coming out in the streets, the mobilization, and the organization. So Nepal is absolutely TBD, but Sri Lanka, highlighted as one of the cases of success, and I don't know if Yana, or Tom want to come in on this, is a great example of, it was a country that was rife with corruption. There were incumbents, that old school incumbents, and there was a movement which was actually pretty well organized, that came to power, and it's doing, it's still early, but it's doing a pretty good job. And as the Freedom House report this year shows, we've seen a substantial climb in the data and the points and the ranking that Sri Lanka has. So the countries that you mentioned, Matt, are countries that were not ever sort of established democracies. So if we're thinking about the countries that are in the middle, in the partly free space, yes, they've struggled, particularly the countries that have experienced a military coup, because there is such a thing as a coup trap, right? Once you have a military coup, it's really hard to stuff that back in the jack in the box, because these actors develop incentives and to stay in politics. So just comparing like for like among the countries that are free, I think Tom has already really, I think, really nicely told us there is a story here of real democratic resilience. But I'll let my other panelists come in if they want to add to that.
Yeah, maybe if I maybe just connect a couple of the dots because I really like what Tom and Maya have said. So I really like flipping the comparison a little bit and saying maybe, instead of what's going wrong in the US that's gone wrong elsewhere, maybe looking at some of these critical junctures. I was struck, Tom mentioned South Korea. South Korea faced a very serious crisis recently, with the president declaring a state of emergency in an effort to sort of overpower the legislature. You saw immediate mobilization against that decision. And then you saw, so kind of bringing together both what Maya was saying about, it's not just about mobilization and it depends on kind of the country you're in. You saw people come out on the streets in South Korea against what the president was trying to do. But then in the longer term, what we've seen over the past years, the courts have kicked in, right? There has been accountability. So there was both sides of the equation. There was the civic mobilization, but then there were strong institutions that functioned the way that they ought to function in a democracy. And so I think those are examples sort of to look at and compare. I think that's an informative comparison. I think also just we should, there are commonalities between democracies and repressive countries. Civil society is incredibly important in both. Civil society is really important in repressive contexts. It's really important in democracies. I think we don't really devote enough attention to the role of civil society in established democracies because we think that we have this direct link to government by voting, by expressing ourselves. But civil society plays a really important role in mobilizing people, in distributing information, in applying consistent pressure. All of those things matter. And they matter as much here as they do when we talk about supporting civil society abroad. So I think, there are kind of important and informative lessons to learn, both in the way that things have unfolded in other countries, but also the things that we prioritize as supporting in repressive environments are also important here in democracies.
Let's throw in a question from the Q&A chat, which is actually, I think, relevant to this conversation about the more mature democracies and their troubles. Is there any correlation between economic inequality and backsliding democracies? Can one even do it on a chart somehow?
I mean, I think I can give it a stab. I think that there is, in that I think economic inequality functions by exacerbating other kind of political trends that then can weaken democracy over time. So I think what you talk about in the report, the efforts by democratically elected, but liberal leaders who undermine institutions, many of those leaders come in on platforms talking about, anti-institutional, but also complaints of, economic inequality, which aren't wrong. But I think, then kind of propel that and then the sort of polarization that can happen as a result of that. And I know that Maya mentioned Sue Stokes. I think that book explains it well, both on the left and the right, the way that has functioned in different countries.
Can I take just stab at that question, Matthew? It's a very important one. It comes up all the time. It seems like every time I speak about the topic, somebody raises their hand and says it's inequality's fault. It's because things are becoming more unequal. That's why there's all this democratic backsliding in the world. I don't think it's that simple. I think it's a contributing factor in some places at some times. But look at a couple of cases that are different. And I did a study of the rates of inequality in countries that have experienced backsliding and found that in the 10 years before the backsliding really started to occur, most of them were not experiencing any particular rise in inequality. Take the case of Poland, for example. Poland seemed to be doing marvelously economically prior to its democratic slide starting in the mid-2010s. Israel is a country that was, again, an economic marvel. People were writing books about the wonder Israeli economy. And then suddenly this slide into what has become quite a degraded democracy in certain ways. One could go through quite a few other such cases. Turkey was an economic miracle in the 2000s, yet it was the very period in which they began backsliding democratically. And so we have to be very careful and think, oh, that's it. I've got the single magic bullet explanation. If we just fix that, we'd fix democracy. So I'd be cautious on that one.
You actually foreshadowed my question back to you, Tom, which is, and this is maybe the last one for me, at least on the US. if you had a magic wand, what would you fix to make this go in the other direction?
Don't tempt me. I happen to think the United States is suffering from a very deep problem, which is there have emerged two visions of America over the last 60 years, since the 1960s. I think it's part of a larger pattern of polarization throughout American history, which has gone through cycles like the Civil War and the New Deal period in the 1960s. Two visions of America, a progressive vision and a non-progressive or a conservative vision. And they, for a whole series of kind of structural and psychological reasons, these visions have become less and less compatible with each other and more hardened among certain groups, not the whole society, but there's 20% on each side, which holds them really firmly and hates the other side and doesn't trust them and so forth. And that's making our political life very difficult for a lot of reasons. And so I've had the magic wand. I would try to find a way that some effective politicians could articulate and then pursue a common vision, which started to take the air out of that balloon a bit and brought people back together around a more common civic vision of the country, which deflated the extremes. So it's quite a magic wand you've given me there, but that's until we get some sense of that from our political system bringing us together rather than apart, then we're going to keep having some of the problems that I think we're having.
Maya, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I come to this from a little bit of a different view than Tom does. I mean, I think I read that article, Tom, right, that in many of these cases of recent backsliders, you weren't experiencing market inequality rises. But, Sue Stokes, president of the American Political Science Association this year, her work shows that economic inequality destabilizes democracy by creating resentment and a sense of kind of unfairness. That leads to polarization, which often populist leaders exploit. And when they do that, they exploit that to justify weakening democratic institutions while maintaining voter support. So I take the point that the world is absolutely multi-causal, and there are lots of things contributing here to this 20-year decline in freedom. But I think it would be a mistake to not include economic inequality as a major driver of democratic decline.
Great. There's a pretty good, pretty smart question that maybe I'm going to read out. That's a little bit in this vein. So one of this year's Freedom in the World recommendations pointed out that young people were increasingly disenchanted with neoliberal democratic institutions. A different recommendation pointed to the potential of corporate, private, sovereign, et cetera, wealth funds to serve as philanthropic sources for democracy development. My question is, how do you square this circle? Yana, that seems squarely at you, actually.
Sure.
I mean, how do youth alienated from neoliberal institutions through neoliberal mechanisms?
Well, I'm not sure that there's a direct link, but let me say, look, I think we are living in a moment where we need to rethink our democracy assistance, our overseas assistance. What we've seen over the past year, and going back a little bit further with Europe, is that we cannot rely on a single or a small number of sources to fund all of this democracy work, which is super important and effective all over the world, just because a change in policy will have devastating effects, as we're seeing now. So we need to look for other options here. And I think companies, corporations have a vested interest in things like the rule of law, in transparency. Companies, there's a reason, going back all the way to the beginning of this conversation and talking about how autocrats have failed to deliver economically. There's a reason that, you're not going to, you no longer have a McDonald's franchise in Russia. And that is true for other countries and other corporations. And so I think pulling in corporations, pulling in private philanthropy, all of those things are really important. I think the engagement of the youth, Maya touched on this. What we're seeing, I think this is a problem around the world, but I'm super interested in what's happening in Africa with regard to this. You have the youngest continent in the world. Average age is 19. You have some of the oldest leaders in the world. The president of Cameroon is 92. And you see Gen Z protests. And going back to this issue of inequality, one way we've seen that expressed is anti-corruption and youth unemployment protests that are toppling governments or that are at least posing a very serious threat to governments. So I think we should take the issue of youth being disengaged from democratic sort of initiatives seriously, but I also think that we need to pave sort of a path forward on a democracy and foreign assistance. So we can't just abandon that as an effort.
Sure, we definitely want to get to that. But this is also suggesting that you need a democracy promotion drive within democracies, and what would philanthropies funded by American oligarchs promoting democracy, would that be actually something that you all would see as being effective? Or would it actually, as the question suggested, potentially, would hardly be the thing that would kind of really mobilize young people or idealistic people generally around defending democracy in established democracies?
I mean, I can let Jan off the hook on this because it's a pretty hard question. I mean, it depends on your oligarch. There are people who've made a lot of money on the capitalist system who've, given it away for some pretty good causes. I think of George Soros. I think also Pierre Omidyar. The Omidyar network is doing tremendous things in a lot of different countries. He's the founder, I think, of eBay. So capitalist par excellence, but he's done some wonderful things with this money. I can think of some other philanthropists who I don't think are doing great things with their money. I mean, some other billionaires who are not doing such great things with their money. So, there's a deeper critique of American philanthropy, which that book whose name I'm forgetting, it's just quite an interesting book, says, we can't really expect the neoliberal titans to seriously challenge the structure of the system that's, strangling certain parts of American democracy. That's worth a hard look. But that doesn't mean that there aren't quite a few people with a lot of resources who are capable of giving the money in ways that can be helpful to people all around the world and in the United States. What's frustrating, I think, is that, as Jana and her colleagues point out in their wonderful report, the amount of US philanthropy that goes for democracy and rights overseas is minuscule compared to how much is going within the United States. And what's frustrating is at the very moment when US government aid for democracy has fallen off the cliff, and we hope philanthropy will be stepping up, part of that same phenomenon, the same people who are causing the fall off in democracy aid, are making many American philanthropists say it's time to turn our attention at home because our system is in trouble. So if anything, there's a trend back home among some American philanthropy to say we need to focus at home. And so the very moment when we're hoping they might step up, they're feeling like, wait a minute, the house is on fire at home. We need to focus here.
Yeah. I want to maybe now shift us from the free world, more or less, into the unfree world. You hear a lot about the crisis of democracy, and you hear very little about the crisis of authoritarianism. And yet, if you look around the world, the authoritarians seem to be the one, their model seems to be quite struggling. There's an authoritarian in Venezuela, obviously with a helping hand from the US, who's now in New York. Putin has been a disaster for his country socioeconomically, or by most metrics, over the last 20 years. Erdogan in Turkey, that country is not doing as well as it was in that first decade, in the 2000s. China got old before it got rich. There's a lot of concern about, the sort of that we're peak China. So I wonder if we're overly narcissistic in another sense, that we're just focusing on us. So that's my maybe observation. If anyone disagrees, please do so. My question is, if we do buy that there is a crisis of authoritarianism, can we, the freer world, do more to hasten its demise? And this is a question about what should we be doing about democracy promotion, rethinking it. But really, I mean, how should we be fighting this adversary and an open adversary?
Do you mind if I jump in maybe just
Please.
that because I love this question. I think, there's so much attention to the roads or the railways or the apartment buildings that autocrats are able to build or the oil they're able to pump. And certainly those contribute to the economy, but that is a shallow level of development and there are real limits to it. And so I think it is right that we should talk about those things. I also, we see how decisions by leaders, first of all, direct decisions by autocrats, but also sort of the indirect consequences of how they govern, cause democracies the economy to deteriorate. We've seen this among the coup leaders in Africa. They have not improved some of them came in with a justification of economic improvement and security. They have not accomplished any of those things. We need to only look at places like Burkina Faso and Mali to understand that. To answer your question, Matt, I think the number one thing we can do is to promote informational exchange. We need to get information out of authoritarian countries, and we need to be able to broadcast truthful and accurate information into authoritarian countries. And that is a way to both understand the dynamics inside those countries, but also to provide the people living in those countries something other than propaganda, something other than what their government is feeding them. And I think that's key. Freedom House has a different project called the China Dissent Monitor, which actually monitors protests across mainland China. And it shows, over 1,000 protests every quarter of every year. And that's really important. That information is important. That means that Chinese citizens are out there protesting. Most of the protests has to do with economic rights, actually. And so I think that information is important. It's important for us to know, and it's important for us to have a way in to speak to those people and offer them, some other vision that is not provided by their government.
Can I throw in a question from Andrew Kolb from the Q&A, who asks, do the cuts to U.S. foreign assistance and decreases in European aid correlate to any of the declines in democracy measured this year, or will it take longer for consequences of cuts to democracy assistance to be measurable?
I think that sorry, Tom, you want to?
Oh, yeah, it might be a question for you since you guys are doing the monitoring. So let you have that.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the short answer is it's too soon to tell, and the impacts are not that direct. I do think that we are seeing some impacts, and I'll maybe talk about Ukraine. Ukraine saw one of the biggest anti-corruption investigations break last year, but before that happened, the Ukrainian government tried to shut down the two main anti-corruption investigation agencies, and they reversed themselves in part because of the pressure applied by ordinary people in civil society, and that's great. One of the biggest cuts in terms of US aid and other aid to Ukraine has been on its anti-corruption projects. And so I think that, of course, by taking away sort of some carrots and some sticks, these problems that we've been trying to address are going to grow.
I was just going to say, Matthew, if I could, that, we've been trying to follow this somewhat at Carnegie and along our team. And for example, we commissioned a paper by a couple of former USAID folks, Daniel Savitt and Susan Abbott, which will be coming out in a month or two on the impact of the US cessation of international media support. And they look at it in a general way, and they look at some focal countries. And it reaffirms what Jana is saying, is that it's not something that happens immediately. It wasn't like democracy aid is, the pillars holding up democracy in these countries. But it's more like there are termites attacking these pillars, and you've thrown aside your pesticide. And so the termites are going to start eating more. Georgia is a good example. Georgia is in the midst of a heart-rending process whereby the government, having basically stolen an election, is now just squeezing and crushing to death Georgian resistance to that. U.S. assistance for independent media in Georgia, for human rights organizations and other civic activists was vital to helping keep that flame alive. And those organizations tell you when you ask them, we are hurting, we have less staff, we have less capability, we had to close this, we can't do that. Now they're valiant. They weren't just dependent on aid to do what they do, but it is required to carry out certain kinds of activities and to hire people to do all kinds of things. And so you can take a case like Georgia and say, yeah, you're undercutting those pillars by, the termites are eating away at it. You're throwing away your pesticide there. And so it is going to happen. There are going to be lots and lots of negative effects all around the world. They're going to be gradual and they're going to be cumulative, and it's actually going to be very hard to trace. So we have to be very careful if people try to say, well, look, a year later, no real big change. I guess that aid was worthless. That would be a very wrong-headed way to think about the question.
Let me pass on my magic wand again to one of you and from the follow-up discussion. So what would you do with democracy assistance? What does democracy assistance in 2026 look like? And this echoes a couple of questions in the Q&A chat here. What would democracy assistance look like in this moment, in this era, wielded by the people we know, the US, the Europeans, the Australians and the New Zealanders or whoever, that would be effective?
So I'll take that.
Passing it to the magic wand.
Yeah. So Tom and Jan have already mentioned this. I'm going to build on their comments. I think the most important way in which democracy assistance can be channeled is to keeping the information landscape free, multiple, diverse. And that means supporting independent reporting on what's happening in each of these countries. So let me just give you a really interesting example. So Bangladesh, we saw this kind of youth movement turned out a government, and we're still seeing the effects of that play out. Now, when these youth protests began, the Bangladeshi government started to repress, and it shut down the media. And it was because there was independent reporting, actually in this case based partly outside of the country, that there was, and that was used and channeled into social media where much of the youth were. So there was very interesting reporting. There was this interesting campaign which focused on the fancy watches that government ministers were wearing, right? And that obviously kind of touched a nerve among the youth. But that's just a really concrete example of what democracy, I think, assistance can do. It can provide support for those kinds of alternative information landscapes. I also just want to say one more thing, though. I mean, I don't sit in the United States. I sit in, Oxford in the United Kingdom. I teach in a very global cohort. And I think it's worth underscoring that there is a lot of cynicism about US democracy support in many corners of the globe. And especially because we are at a time of rising nationalism everywhere. I think we need to be very careful in how we think about democracy assistance and what the US can do, because to a certain extent, and I think that we see this, in places like Iran today, it has to come, the democracy movements have to come from within this country. And I think there can be enabling landscapes like the media landscape that democracy assistance can support. But the US record on democracy promotion abroad is frankly very poor.
But I remember in days I used to go to the Caucasus or the Middle East. There was NDI and IRI were helping develop political parties. You had broadcasts from Radio Farda, Radio for Europe that Jamie used to run. What else were we doing? We're doing sort of scholarships to bring young people to the US or to Europe to learn about our ways, and that was what that looked like. And is that what that looks like going forward? Are we missing? Is there some killer app or some large language model which we can train to help sort of inculcate values in 1 billion Chinese or something? I don't know. Surely this has got to shift somehow, right? The way we think about democracy promotion in light of the changes, not just the political changes, but the technological changes. Like, how would you disrupt democracy promotion? If maybe I could rephrase that question.
Well, one way you would disrupt it, is a huge question, Matthew. But one way you could disrupt it is stop thinking of it as givers and recipients. Think of democracy assistance as a huge global mass learning project, a mutual learning project in which everybody in a country who wants to see their society more democratic is engaged in trying to support democracy and learning from each other across borders in all directions, as opposed to thinking of it as aid that goes from one place to another. And instead, it's resources that help facilitate that big learning process by lots of different people. Because the best kind of democracy aid is the activation of minds. It's the realization you can do things, the knowledge of how to do those things. And that comes from sharing, from exchange, from learning, et cetera, across borders in all directions. And so the well-justified cynicism that Maya talks about in the students that she teaches, you say, no, this is not about the UK or the US coming to tell you what to do. This is about you want to do this. We actually have those same challenges. Let's work together and figure it out. That at least is the start of a new conversation.
Do you agree? Maybe go ahead.
Yeah, so sorry, just maybe I'm not in the business of democracy disruption, so I'm gonna not look at that question. But I think just in terms of what Tom is saying,
promotion disruption, not democracy itself. Yeah,
I'm not in the business of
promotion.
democracy promotion disruption either. I think that one cure or one way to tackle cynicism that Maya was talking about, and also to talk about what, to touch on what Tom was saying in terms of activating minds, it's talking to human rights defenders. Human rights defenders are some of the most optimistic people in the world. They exist everywhere, and they're doing really important work, both in sort of just like life-saving, important, getting people out of prison, saving the environment, things like that. But they're also defending the rights on which democracy is based, right? So they're not necessarily advocating directly and just saying, well, what we really need here are, free and fair elections. But they're doing things like showing the watches, the fancy watches that autocrats wear to get outrage about what they're doing. They're doing things like providing free legal support for people who are maybe challenging the government. They're running these open media sources that we've talked about. And so I think if I had a magic wand and could say that we could only do one thing with democracy, promotion or foreign assistance, I would say it's supporting human rights defenders. And unfortunately, I think that's going to be among the biggest and maybe most immediate impacts of what's happened in the last year.
I want to pick up on Maya's point and disagree with it a little bit that the US and Europe are not as credible as they used to be in promoting democracy. And my only proof is not actually on that side. It's still that, young people still want to go to university in the US. People still want to travel and visit Europe. They still consume disproportionately our culture, meaning, American, European culture than other cultures. So I just wonder, why do we think we're not as credible clearly our model is appealing in so many different ways?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And absolutely, that is also true, right? I mean, when students from, you name it, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, China, get the chance to study in a top American university, essentially they if they can, in terms of finances and visas, they come. And that is an enormous source of soft power for the United States. But I think that that's different from saying that US democracy promotion efforts have a good record, which is what I was just pointing at. And, anecdotally, but, as I said, I have students from 50 countries in my classroom. I've taught in that environment for 12 years. There is very consistently cynicism, about the US's role. And, it came up most recently when we talk about, the US role in Iran, and we're talking today about, the US administration is talking about regime change in Iran. And, if you don't have to go back very far in history to the installation of the Shah to see that that was part of US foreign policy. So when you step back and look at the record as a whole, research has just shown it's not very effective in instantiating kind of pro-democratic regime change. But I agree with you, that's not inconsistent with people wanting to study in, these top American universities. And I think those are both true at the same time.
I mean, I will note that one of the more than one thing that I think President Obama and Trump have in common, in a separate conversation, but one of them is neither of those two presidents invoked democracy promotion and actually avoided that phrase as much as possible. There's a question from Jim Riker, which I want to pose to you. How much of the decline in global governance institutions, the United Nations, and others, has contributed, do you think, to democracy erosion?
Well, I can maybe start. We looked at some of this. I would say that the two things are linked. It's not so much that the institutions themselves. I mean, first of all, just to go back to this discussion, I feel that we can be realistic about the limits of democratic rhetoric and democracy promotion while still saying these are actually things that we agree with and these are ideas that we endorse and things we should be doing. And I say that because what I'm about to say about the UN and other organizations, I think has the same tension, which is that it is true that it's not like since the founding of the United Nations, there have been no wars or there have been no human rights violations. There are wars, there are human rights violations, but it's a forum that provides the opportunity for multilateralism, for conversation, for finding these solutions. Yes, it's slow. Yes, it's about process. That's all of those things are true, but it provides these valuable services to the international community. And what's been happening is not so much that the UN or other organizations are failing at what they're doing, they're being undermined from within. And they're being undermined from within in two ways. One is that democracies are not contesting these spaces. We are leaving seats open for autocrats to be elected to the Human Rights Council. We're abandoning the Human Rights Council altogether. We're withdrawing our financial aid at the same time that China and Russia and others in the like-minded group of states are injecting more money and trying to control some of these organizations at the UN and other places. And so I think those two things are happening simultaneously. And so I wouldn't say that the UN is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. I would say that the UN is trying to do what it's supposed to be doing while understanding that it is an organization of member states. And so it really depends on what those member states are doing.
Super. We're actually approaching time. So I want to thank this terrific panel. I want to thank the Freedom House team for their great work. There were a lot of really great, smart questions in the Q&A. I got to a fair number of them, not all of them. So apologies for that. I also want to flag that you can download the report on the Freedom House site. Please visit freedomhouse.org. and to learn more about what we discussed today. Thanks very much to everyone. Have a good day.